Mode.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Moss. I'm CEO of Pneuron, and allow me to thank you and welcome you for joining this webinar. This is the first webinar that Pneuron has done. We're delighted to have Forrester, and specifically George Laurie, Principal Analyst from Forrester, to join us. We're going to be focusing today on competitive agility. It's something easier said than done, but really a primary driver towards many of the decisions that large enterprises are making, both in the way that they're responding to a continuous set of changes in the regulatory market, a more sophisticated, more demanding, and more mobile client base, and an increasing demand to understanding risk in a very complex, very distributed organization. We're going to break this meeting or this conversation down into really three sections. First of all, George is going to take us through talking about why agility is so important, but more importantly to talk about the barriers that really prevent agility from being introduced into an institution, not just technology barriers, but also cultural, organizational barriers as well. I'll then take it over and talk about a few specific use cases where clients have really looked at agility and really introduced practical and relevant solutions into solving very complex distributed problems for a fraction of the time and cost that the normal deployment, development, and maintenance schedules with traditional technology approaches would suppose. At the end, we're going to open the session up for some questions and answers. We look forward to a robust debate, and we look forward to a lot of questions as well. So many thanks. Please enjoy the next 45 minutes. We look forward to presenting this to you, and at this point, I move over to George.
Thanks very much, Simon, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us for this session, which, as Simon has said, is entitled Competitive Agility, Innovation Without Disruption. Now, those of you who know Forrester, and I'm George Laurie, Vice President and Principal Analyst here at Forrester. I've been here for 10 years. Our job really is to help the largest organizations in the world to manage changes in technology and changes in the market. And you can imagine that those large organizations already have significant investment, but all of them are under an agility imperative. And if we think about that agility imperative, I think none of you will be at all surprised to know that the environment has changed enormously for those companies. We're already seeing what used to be called developing markets becoming extremely significant, and in some cases the most important markets for some of our clients. So we're seeing new markets open up for them. We're also seeing completely new types of product and service offering, very often relying on IT or digital enablement in order to deliver their value. And we're also, of course, seeing new channels. So significant change, much more complexity in their environment. So the traditional matrix that they had, perhaps a product and market, is now turned upside down, and that has really severe implications for their systems. But it's not just the business environment that's changing. If we think about the people who are coming in to work in these companies, there are much more demanding users than ever there were before. Certainly those people that we refer to as millennials, those people who've been born into the digital age, they actually expect to bring their own devices, sometimes to bring their own software into the workplace. And they typically do think that they're better at provisioning their own IT than IT departments in large corporations. Now, as the workplace changes and becomes even more demanding, it becomes much more complex for corporate IT to manage and harness all this kind of creativity. And if we think about it, it's not really just the fact that the environment is changing and that the users themselves are changing. Sometimes the things that IT does itself can sometimes contribute to the complexity. And if you think about it, most large IT organizations, they're spending perhaps 70 or even 80% of their budget on just trying to maintain all the IT that they have. There's very little really available relatively for innovation. So this becomes really quite a significant challenge for them. Some of them try to use public infrastructure, and they try to innovate in that way to try and take the things which are very standardized and non-differentiating and perhaps centralize them or even outsource them. But when we think about that, and particularly think about infrastructure as a service, or software as a service, or platform as a service, that can introduce yet another barrier or another obstacle to agility. So if we look on the next slide, we'll start thinking now about some of the barriers to agility. The technology stack itself does frustrate agility. All of us in IT, we think about trying to standardize our offering to try and keep it at low cost, and by doing that, we necessarily create those silos, as people call them, which frustrate the way in which our customers and sometimes our users expect to interact with us. They don't respect, perhaps, the fact that this is a CRM system and that is an ERP system. They just want to have one view of the customer. So the stacks that we have, the way that we provision our applications, and the way that we structure our infrastructure, our middleware, our hardware, all of this contributes to making a journey between different touch points, the ability to easily pass between one channel and another, and the ability for our customers and for our employees to discover what they want, to use what they want, and to get support becomes increasingly frustrated. And I think cross-channel is probably the type of interaction that's most revealed the complexity that's introduced and the lack of agility by sticking our IT into stacks. Now, one solution for that, or one approach, is to try and think about different methods of tackling that agility. But again, one of the things that we've also seen as a barrier to agility is the rise of governance and regulatory oversight. So in the last few years, we've seen quite a lot of concern about risk, and we've seen that not just in financial industries, but in perhaps food traceability, certainly in pharmaceuticals, also in healthcare. And what that really has done is introduce a barrage of additional regulatory reporting and oversight. All of us will have had to, for example, think about our compliance with Sarbanes-Oxley. And one of the issues that that introduces is to make us think in IT that we really don't want to change anything. Once we're in a position where we know that we can produce those regulatory reports, the last thing we want to do is to make any changes, perhaps for a new channel or a new market or a new product or service offering. So that level of regulatory oversight is a further barrier to agility. And then as we go forward and think about different ways of delivering our applications, sometimes that application delivery diversity contributes even further to being a barrier to agility. So increasingly we find our clients, at least they're very sophisticated end users, are often perhaps provisioning their own systems with software as a service, and generally speaking they're allowed to do that and perhaps even encouraged to do it in the name of agility. Difficulty is now that in the long run that can be costly, but it also it might frustrate the enterprise-wide view of data. We also see that the IT people themselves exploiting opportunities in infrastructure as a service, and perhaps also in platform as a service, to enable them to try and be at least more agile in one part of the business. The difficulty is when we look at that at an enterprise level, it really introduces yet another layer of complexity, which means ultimately it's harder for us to respond to change. So we've looked a little bit at the reasons why we have to be agile. We've looked at some of the barriers to agility. The next thing I want to do is to look at what are the implications of the way that we organize. Simon talked about this as really not primarily a technology problem, but more an organization and culture problem. So our culture at the moment and our traditional approaches certainly appear to be delivering quite poorly. First, on the promise of low cost, which originally was the reasons for the stacks and the centralization. We know also that it's delivering poorly on flexibility because of the extent to which end users are provisioning their own applications. And we know also that it's delivering poorly in terms of integration. So single view of the customer is still a huge problem for many companies that might have perhaps their sales data in a cloud system and perhaps their invoice collection system on-premise. So the current approaches are certainly flawed, and let's look and see why they are and what those approaches are. So we talked a little bit about the idea of software as a service, improving flexibility, but it certainly will frustrate integration. And in the long term, the really interesting thing is when we ask people why are they doing it, they often talk about reducing overall cost. We know that in the long term, it certainly doesn't do that. So as we move forward and think about the two different models we've been exploring, we've been thinking about a standardized, or what we call industrialized business technology approach, which centralizes everything and is typically promising a low cost and often frustrates the agility of the business. We know actually in the long run that that is extremely damaging to agility, and even in the long run doesn't introduce the cost advantages that were expected. The second model that we commonly see, we call this embedded business technology, where really the business units and the business itself, the end users, are allowed to choose whatever they want. To really, we call this self-provisioning. And of course this is very popular with the smarter and let's say more IT savvy people coming into the line of business. They expect and they want to provision their own applications. The difficulty is in the long run this also frustrates agility, because although their individual business unit may be agile, what's the impact on the ability to cross-sell or upsell, or to look at our risk for a group of customers across the world, or look at our exposure to a particular supplier? So those two approaches, what we call industrialized business technology, very centralized, and embedded business technology, extremely decentralized, neither of those seems to really meet the objectives of providing agility without disrupting the investments that have already been made and the benefits that large companies have from synergy in IT. What we're beginning to see, and if we look on the next slide, we'll see we're beginning to see a new way of thinking about this to evolve. We call this an empowered or federated approach. So we're beginning to see organizations that say we've invested very heavily in our systems of record, our existing systems, our large enterprise systems, and that's going to be a platform that will continue to maintain the standardization and the stability. We'll have in there, let's say, our key master data about our customers and our suppliers, maybe the products that we sell or the services that we deliver. But what we're going to do is to work very hard to find out how business and IT can co-develop the solutions around that core that they need to be agile. And we're going to make sure that they can do this in an iterative manner. So rather than the old days of creating a specification and handing it over to somebody, we're going to try and deliver a minimum viable product, and we're going to try and improve on that. And the main thing is that we're going to do it collaboratively. It won't be business or IT, it'll be business and IT. So that's really the kind of approach that we've seen people begin to evolve. I'd like to ask Simon really to talk a little bit about how that works in practice. But first, I've just got a slide which gives my details if you want to contact me. Simon, over to you.
Thank you, George. Unfortunately, the slide with your details is at the back, so I'll make sure that everybody sees that. Thank you very much. Very interesting. I think the way George summarized is really agility is somewhat contradictory to many of the organizational, technical, and deployment models that we've been using over the last decade. However, the market is evolving extremely quickly. The speed and mobility and decision complexity of the client, the continuing growth and acceleration of different types of endpoints, operating models, products, asset classes, are all adding very, very significant pressure on enterprises' time to value, agility, cost, and need to provide the type of risk transparency that the regulators are demanding from them. So really over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about three real areas. One, what are the enablers of agility? And these enablers are not just technology, but really cultural and communication as well. Then run through 5 specific use cases where clients have deployed highly agile technologies and aligned it to the business users and the business requirements very effectively. And then finally, in the design points for agility, we're summarizing the whole structure, and we'll move to a Q&A session. And before we start, 3 statistics that I think are extremely important when this conversation moves forward. The first is 70 cents in the dollar of every project dollar. Risk management, CRM, operational productivity, regulatory reporting is spent on identifying, normalizing, moving, storing, and optimizing data in some sort of data construct, be that a database, an ETL, MDM construct, a data mart, some sort of data virtualization alignment. More troublingly, 55 cents of that 70 cents is an exact repeat of at least 5 other projects over the last 3 years. So an enormous amount of inefficiency both at the front end and also replication as additional projects are run forward. And as those applications are implemented, their valuable life is measured in the 4 to 6 year period, and that is quantified as either needing replacement, needing a major upgrade, or needing new infrastructure to deal with the type of volumes as the enterprise becomes more expanded and tends to grow. So those 3 statistics are 3 elements that really map George's concerns to the need to look at how agility is deployed, designed, and managed. So when we look at agility at Pneuron, we really look at the left moving across to the right. The first is we need to bridge the gap between the user and the IT department, between the individuals that come up with the ideas, the individuals that really focus on the vision of the solution, and the people that deploy the solution. And so there needs to be a new lingua franca. And luckily, George pointed to a millennial generation, or a new generation coming in who've grown up through visual IT, Xboxes, iPads, iPhones, and there's a growing drive towards end users being much more intimate with the IT organization in the definition and articulation of requirements, and then using configuration technology, visualization, objects to really deploy those solutions. But at the same time, enterprises have spent close to $1 trillion on various applications, databases, middleware, infrastructure, business intelligence, BPM. Huge amounts of investments have gone into outstanding applications. The challenge is these applications are not brought together effectively. And if they are brought together, they're brought through monolithic, large, cumbersome, expensive, and often prone to failure centralization systems integration projects. So the deployment model of this user IT requirements structure that I pointed to needs to be non-invasive, non-disruptive, needs to use the existing leverage the existing technologies and IT already in place, and therefore needs to be very technology agnostic. In other words, non-competitive with the investments that have already been made. Now what that means is each one of those investments operate in different timescales, in different approaches, in different outputs, and therefore integration is fundamental, and it also needs in that way to be event-driven. And it is the event-driven side that tends to enable the responsiveness of the speed of the business itself, of the solution itself. And it really, in that way, reduces the cycle time much more to a minimum. Cycle time has often been pushed to a solution that has involved a large centralized database. You can see with the 70 cents in the dollar that we pointed to earlier. And that has really reduced the ability to innovate, create ideas, respond to regulators, respond to competitive imperatives. The last point is often ignored when people talk about agility, and that is infrastructure. That is the classical IT demands around uniform security, predictable performance, enterprise class resiliency, enterprise class agility, availability, to ensure that the level of IT service supporting the business, supporting their clients, is of the 24/7 performance, availability, and security that the enterprise has grown up with and expects. And so that means any solution that supports agility at the front end, at the user, also needs to be highly agile at the back end. The only solution that we believe would solve that is essentially establishing a set of enablers that fundamentally change the way enterprise architecture is deployed. The first is look at what the intermediaries are that hold back the opportunity to realize agility, time to market, low cost of solution deployment. The first is the database. Now, Pneuron is not anti-database. We just believe that it is in the wrong place. We believe, as many of our clients do, that the database should not be the prerequisite for the creation of value. That the database or the data virtualization construct should not be populated prior to running any analytics. And we're going to talk through a couple of use cases today that shows the fundamental difference between the traditional mechanism of moving the data to the analytics through a database construct, or against a different model in which takes the analytics and distributes it to the source or sources, enabling the client to remove the large systems data integration, data normalization, data optimization project that is always considered the prerequisite for the creation of regulatory, risk management, customer, or business intelligence value. Add to that the ability to allow the user and the IT individuals to work together very closely. In other words, to short-circuit the misalignment of requirements gathering, of requirements articulation, and restore the collaboration between those people with vision and the people that are responsible for deploying that vision. And that is the element of user-driven configuration, supported by non-invasive integration, supporting multiple different technologies and legacy environments. So what we're really doing is taking the intelligence out of the database, out of the centralization paradigm, and putting it in a network and establishing it as essentially a distributed value chain, an orchestrated value chain, and which is invasive and agnostic to the components that are in that value chain, being data, analysis, solution, or even processing. That means that the complete solution can be maintained, managed, and updated completely dynamically. Because remember, we talked about systems being replaced between 4 to 6 years, or being radically having to be re-engineered or performance optimized with new hardware. Well, doing change is almost as important as the original project in the first place. So being able to maintain, manage, and update new data sources, new analytics, new models, new elements of the solution in a very quick, very intuitive way is fundamental to the deployment, because otherwise the solution you've deployed starts to become stale the day you've deployed it. And then lastly, to support this requires a very significant redesign in the way technology has been put together. The way Pneuron looks at it is we seek to establish uniform interoperability between distributed components of value, whether they be data sources, databases, files, documents, web services, middleware, streaming data. We treat all those data sources in a completely agnostic manner. And we allow the client to integrate them, distribute analysis out to them, and run the processing at the source. So a Pneuron deployment is fully distributed from business definition requirements, data, analysis, and processing, all distributed using the existing infrastructure that the client has. So with this zero infrastructure design, with this type of agility, with this ability for the customer or the user at the customer and the IT department of the customer to work very closely together, you better know what you're talking about when it comes to the traditional infrastructure designs or demands around security, resiliency, availability, and performance. And therefore, this needs to be built in to any agility project that you gather. And it should not be seen as separate. It should not be seen as the last state to say, we've got a great idea, we've deployed it, now let's optimize it against the infrastructure. It needs to be part of the DNA of the implementation. So Neuron's design, dynamic scaling, resiliency, and full orchestration is all off the shelf, already built in to the design that the client is deploying. We call it distributed solutions, a completely non-invasive way to establish agility, competitive innovation, risk management transparency, operational integration and reporting, to be able to distribute not just the solution, but the entire value chain in a fully uniform manner, in a fully integrated manner, irrespective of where the sources of the components of the solution are. They could be in the cloud, they could be on relational databases, they could be in mainframes, they could be in sitting on the middleware, they could be on anywhere in the planet. Now we're able to do that because we use a network, or all of these components are components of a network. And the network enables us to really orchestrate how the solutions are distributed. And these network-based components and resources enable us to distribute all of these elements across the entire client data and application topography, pick and choose what the client wants to do, integrate them in real time, and establish an event-driven network that encapsulates itself as either a report, an application, a piece of analytics, a process, indeed an entire operating model. Now we've been able to establish agility, and we measure agility in a total cost of ownership for full end deployment for, being less than 50% of the original business case. And we are able to achieve those numbers because of really not just looking at the agility profile in the way that the user puts requirements together, not just in the way that it is deployed, very lightweight, non-invasive components that are interoperable through the network, but also because we're deploying the enablers or distributing the enablers as well: control, scheduling, security, processing. The entire end-to-end chain of the solution stack is distributed across a uniformly interoperable single instance. So to run through a few case studies to really talk how each one of these were, or each one of these elements were deployed. The first is distributed processes. The anti-money laundering, an intriguing regulatory demand. Anti-money laundering is really looking for not a needle in a haystack, but really a needle in a stack of needles. The primary focus is to find individuals that are laundering money through an enterprise. The primary mathematical algorithm for identifying these is a thing called outlier detection. It is looking for anomalies in behavior. But most money launderers don't want to look different. They don't want to look like an anomaly. So you tend to generate a lot of very significant volumes in false positives. Now most financial institutions deal with false positives, and a false positive is defined as a case that looks like money laundering but actually isn't. The investigation of that case is exactly the same time period as if it was a money laundering case in itself, and this client took around 2 hours to investigate them all. They're solving it by throwing huge numbers of people at the issue. So we have thousands of individuals looking at alerts from a case management system, and the number of alerts that end up as false positives after a 2-hour investigation for each one of them is around 90%. So very significant inefficiency. This client then said, well, the problem we have is that all the analyst needs to go to different data sources, different systems, and bring that information together. What we'll do is we'll move all that data into a dashboard and enable the analyst to make decisions. In other words, we will move the data to the analytics, the data to the analyst. They got the process down to half an hour, a very significant improvement. Pneuron walked in and they gave it to us, and we gave them a completely different alternative. Our solution was this. We took the analytics, we put it into neurons, and these are objects, network-based resources, distributed them out to the source systems. So when in the morning the analyst came in, they would click on their case management system, and this is their case management system. Remember, non-invasive design. The network would fire, and immediately, every time an analyst hit a case, a little black box called the heads-up display, which is a floating Java launchpad, would pop up and say, this is a false positive, this is why, this is the tertiary, referential, and primary data that you need to support this conclusion. And this happened in a couple of seconds. And so the process was, instead of moving the data to the analytics, move the analytics out to the data, and the analyst was no longer analyzing, but rather validating pre-processed intelligence. And we put a very, very significant productivity improvement into the organization. And I think you can extrapolate the productivity when we took a 2-hour to half an hour process down to a couple of seconds. Risk management. So this is distributed analytics. In this case, the client had multiple different systems. They had an extremely large data integration project supporting it. There were large amounts of volumes going into a centralized database. They were accelerating the speed of that database with a Hadoop framework, so that was good. However, it was still taking multiple hours to generate the type of risks that the client required. In addition, the client had multiple different analytical routines, and they did not have the standards that they required either. So what Pneuron did, just once again, same paradigm, used their internal network to distribute components out to the various data sources. This client then also took what we call an analytics neuron and put value at risk, capital at risk, some bond arbitrage and bond hedge algorithms into them as well. It's merely a case of importing. And 3 things happened. The first is they were able to deploy real-time risk management across their global enterprise for about 30% of the original budget. They were able to integrate the 5 value at risk models that they were using and run real-time delta analysis to identify what was different between the different value at risk or VAR engines. 3 of them were exactly the same. They shut them down, so they began to standardize their reporting. And lastly, the global risk officer could get up in the morning, click on his iPad, and see a real-time heartbeat of capital adequacy, stress test parameters and indices, and other metrics and other metrics that they were interested in. If one of the peaks in the heartbeat went past a particular threshold, he was alerted on his iPad. He could click on it, drill down to the individual geography, the individual system, the individual trader, the individual transaction, all in real time. A fully event-driven process as distributed analytics orchestrated by the client's network. You notice here that the database has been completely removed. Well, it hasn't. The database has barely been moved from the front of the process and put into the back of the process instead. Instead of it being the prerequisite for the creation of value, it is now the repository of value that has already been created, the audit of the value that has already been created. Another example we'll talk about, in this case, the client does use a database, FATCA. I go back to the 70 cents in the dollar. Close to $300 billion has been spent on CRM systems, KYC systems, client data remediation systems, and multiple other anti-money laundering, Patriot Act, and other reporting requirements to establish a single representation of the client and client activities. And yet the IRS is telling the market that it is going to spend between $20 to $25 billion in the next 2 years in doing FATCA reporting. And the vast majority of FATCA reporting is understanding the activities of your high net worth clients abroad. So the vast majority of FATCA is an exact repeat of every other project that's been run in client remediation, client data cleansing over the last few years. What Pneuron is doing in this case is we're putting a different type of object out, or a different type of network resource out, and that is called a matching neuron. And that matching neuron is running real-time, probabilistic and deterministic matching across multiple sources. We've connected a BPM neuron to it, so if specific data is missing, if specific documents are missing, a remediation workflow is put into place so that relationship managers can then populate and fill any gaps within the data or reporting process. And then all of this information is passed in real time directly to, frankly, an Oracle database. The client calls it a golden copy. At that point, different network resources or different neurons are used. Analytics to support FATCA, to support KYC, to support credit risk. And the customer is simply able to add new analytical routines, new applications, new ideas, new concepts extremely quickly. This whole deployment was done globally in 8 weeks. So I keep talking about infrastructure, and I can safely say that when you promise agility, the way we're working with our clients, you must be able to understand infrastructure. You must be able to deal with volumes. You must be able to orchestrate security, scheduling, governance, and all of the elements that have traditionally been solved by large, cumbersome centralization projects. So this is a client that had a wonderful piece of intellectual property. They were looking to replace it, or they were looking to rewrite it because it could not deal with the volumes. There was a multi-hour batch window to support, to actually run the application. Instead, they gave it to us. We put it in a neuron called a wrapper neuron, or an exoskeleton, as some of our people call it. And at that point, our system was able to fully dynamically and fully elastically spin up new versions of the application in a completely asynchronous manner. Zero infrastructure was required for this deployment, as we were using the existing processing capacity that was already on servers connected in the network. And bear in mind that most servers are replaced at between 60 to 70% utilization. And so 3 things happened with this. 1, performance went from multiple hours to less than 12 minutes. 2, the legacy application became, frankly, a globally available interoperable service. So multiple elements could be added to this: predictive models, new analytics, distribution of results through mobile and different endpoints. And 3, the client was able to do this at a fraction of the replacement or rewrite cost that they'd budgeted. Now, if you take all the complexity together and look at a much more complicated distributed operating model or a full distributed solution, let's look at mergers and acquisitions. M&A to realize business value takes around 3 years. Extremely important business requirements like consolidated books and records takes about 2.5 years. Why? Because we are having to physically merge data centers, physically sunset certain systems and propagate and promote other systems as global standards. In other words, business value realization is directly calibrated to the IT integration. But what if it wasn't? What if we could virtually integrate the 2 organizations? What if we could decouple the realization of business value from the traditional IT integration demands and mechanisms? Well, this is what we're doing, enabling the client to integrate by bringing matching neurons, analytics neurons, and distributed them across the network that connects the 2 enterprises public or private, and enabling the client to build a single customer reference base, which is then propagated and permissioned back to the two firms. Enables them to build multiple new products and services off that golden copy or off that data representation. Enables them to wrap applications and make them globally available services to both organizations. And in other words, enables the institutions to realize the business value that was the primary component of the investment thesis for the merger to be realized in 8 months instead of 3 years. To do a consolidated books and records in 3 months instead of 2.5 years. Now, there was a question, I've just seen a question pop up on chat. Yes, we absolutely leave the architecture where it is. The architectures of the two institutions stay the same. Why? Well, because we have specifically decoupled or pulled away the value realization from the traditional IT integration. Two things are extremely valuable in that design. The first is the business receives the value that they want very quickly. We've talked enough about that. The second, however, is the IT departments of the two institutions can focus on merging physically the two data centers, databases, applications in a consistent, disciplined, and organized manner instead of constantly being badgered about the business delivering against the business case that the original merger was required by, pushed to. And therefore, this decoupling not only brings business value, brings business agility, but it also allows the IT department to do their jobs properly, to do their jobs effectively, and to drive up, ultimately, their productivity as well. Thank you for that question. So at this point, I would like to open it up to questions and answers. I'm going to leave this here. We define agility as reducing the total cost of ownership of the deployment. And I mean total, because I do not want us to walk away feeling that, okay, it's very simple to do agility. It isn't. Agility involves organizational communication. Agility involves establishing a lingua franca so that communication can be clear and articulate across the entire enterprise. Agility requires a new way of deploying value and extracting value from an organization that is extremely distributed, extremely complex, and is growing in that distribution and complexity. And agility requires infrastructure and the classic technical demands of great enterprise design, security, performance to be part of the DNA of the agility decision. So with that in mind, I want to thank everybody for bearing with us and listen to this. I hope it was useful. I hope it piqued your interest and stimulated some new ideas on how to approach some of these challenges. And I'll open it up to some questions. Oh, good. We're getting a couple now. How well does a distributed approach handle very large data volumes? Well, let's define very large. Pneuron and our distributed approach is not in the HP Vertica, Teradata, EMC Greenplum space. We will leave classical big data, data mining, running behavioral, statistical, and computationally intense mathematical analysis against huge amounts of data. We will leave that to them. We think they're outstanding at it. We define a business problem as the components of the solution are distributed and therefore complex to access. The traditional mechanism of solving that distributed complexity has been to move everything into one place. But that movement into a centralization design stimulates a volume issue. And therefore, big data tends to try to solve distributed problems incorrectly. What Pneuron is doing is Pneuron is taking the analytics out to the sources and running the analysis locally of the available processing capacity at the source, using the data in its native form and orchestrating the results into an integrated network. Now, each one of those sources will have significant volume. And we're dealing with, very significant volume at the individual sources. But we are breaking down that volume issue into the individual components and distributing the process across the network rather than dealing with monolithic and giant volumes at a central point. So with Pneuron, we can both horizontally and vertically scale to take advantage of a single server or even multi-server availability. You're deploying a platform across a network, so you spread your solution across existing infrastructure, and this affords a great deal of flexibility. And the distributed approach actually enables a lot of strong compatibility with the existing cloud, grid, swarm, and network environments that many clients have put in place as well. What is the impact on IT's enterprise architecture when adopting a distributed approach? Well, I think I'm going to define that as how disruptive is a Pneuron solution. We need to design a non-invasive deployment. That is what we do. That is what our clients require, because our clients do not want to do radical change to the very significant legacy investments that they've already made frankly, in applications that are outstanding at their individual objectives. So our distributed solution emphasizes a non-invasive, lightweight model that allows the business and the IT to collaborate on a single screen, allows them to distribute uniformly interoperable components that are technology agnostic, and that are non-invasive and actually cooperate with the existing systems and the existing architecture that is already in place. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not seeing any other questions, so at this point I will draw a conclusion. I want to say thank you very much to everybody for bearing with us. I hope this was an interesting webinar. We expect to do many more in the future. We hope that both you learned something and also we gave Pneuron a little bit more exposure to you. Please feel free to reach out to anybody in the organization. We look forward to continuing our conversations with you. And once again, many thanks for joining us today.